So I'm Graham Simpson. I'm the convener of the cross-party group. This is the third evidence session that we're having on our inquiry into decarbonising public transport, and tonight's meeting is about ferries. Now we've got a couple of speakers. Neil Commode, who will speak second. He has to leave just before 7 o'clock, so that's really why we need to get going. If I could ask those of you joining us online, if you could rename yourself to state your full name and your organisation, if that's possible. As I said, the meeting is being recorded. It will be published. And if I could also ask those of you online, if you could just avoid using the chat function. If you do use it, you'll probably be talking to yourself because I won't see it. If you just, once the speakers have finished, just put your virtual hands up and we'll come to you. And with that, I think we'll just get started. So can I thank the two speakers that we've got? We have, right, I'm going to have a crack at this. Asbjørn Torvanger, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, from the Centre for International Climate and Environmental Research. He'll be followed by Neil Commode of the European Marine Energy Centre. And Asbjørn will be talking about green public procurement of electric ferry services in Norway, a solution for other shipping nations. Neil's subject is why ferry fuels matter, an energy island perspective. So, Asbjørn, do you want to go first?
Yes. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the decarbonization of the ferry segment of shipping in Norway. So I will try to share my screen. I hope this works out. Can you see the screen now, or
That's good. Yeah, that works.
Maybe I should have it in slide form or show. Is that? Let me see.
No, we can see that fine.
You can see it fine. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So I do think that this is a success story, and as you notice, I changed the title a bit, to make it pinpoint that I think this is a success story from Norway, and hopefully this could also give some or insights or experience that could be of relevance to Scotland. So let me start with the first battery hybrid or battery electric ferry in the world, which you can now see on the left. It's called Ampere. This came into service in 2015, crossing the biggest fjord in Norway called Sognefjorden. And there's been a fast increase in a number of these battery electric ferries in Norway. Just also to mention the context of this, my presentation is then based on an article, as you can see on the right-hand side here, on carbon dioxide mitigation from public procurement with environmental conditions, the case of short sea shipping in Norway, which has a bit broader perspective than I'm going to talk about here. Okay, so I should also then mention that for preparedness reasons, these ferries also have a fossil-fueled engine. Reason for this is that many of these ferries are an essential part of the main railroad infrastructure in Norway. And if there should be some power failure, they can still operate because they have these mainly diesel powered engines. So let's look at where are we today in terms of number of electric car ferry connections. And if you first look at the graph at the left, you can see that there's actually been a very steep increase in the number of these ferries since 2018. And now we are up to 37% of the 132 car ferry connections in Norway. So this is 49 out of these car ferry connections. And if we look at the geography on the upper right, we see the number of, or we see the situation of these electric car ferry connections in the green circles, whereas on the lower right you see the remaining fossil car ferry connections. Of course, not all of these can be transformed to electric connections, but I'll come back on that. So the idea here is that for these ferries we have a green or a public procurement system whereby concessions are given to the ferry companies either at the national level or at the county level. And the major instrument that has made this possible is what I refer to as green public procurement. Simply saying that when they have out a tender or this competition on these concessions, they require that the ferries can operate in a climate-friendly and low-carbon way. And this has turned out to be a very efficient way of changing or transferring the ferry sector to electric operation in Norway. And we actually expect that most car ferries will be electric operated by 2030. However, there will be some slower transition for passenger express boats and ferries, which are mostly the larger ferries and with longer service routes, because it's more challenging to operate these with the battery electric energy, because there are longer connections and it's more difficult to recharge the batteries compared to the kind of shorter car ferry services. This has also been supported by government through funding of local grid and charging facilities at the ferry ports, which was also then necessary, of course, to be able to operate these electric ferries. In this paper I showed you, I also looked at what are the opportunities for 3 other segments of shipping in Norway, what is called short sea or shipping close to the borders or to the shores and coastal Norway, express boats, offshore, and aquaculture support vessels. So according to the analysis, I came out with a potential to reduce Norwegian emissions by 1.5%. So what I actually did there was to look at taking the kind of best practice on the electric ferries, because they can use this battery electric operation, which is kind of very now available technology and working well, but comparing then with the technological conditions, with the operational conditions, and also with acceptance in the shipping industry and among the general public, and comparing that to the success of the ferry sector. And I do believe that green public procurement can be used by other shipping nations, such as Scotland. I should also mention that in terms of the offshore and aquaculture support vessels, we are talking about licenses for operation, not concessions, whereas for express boats, there are concessions. So these are then the 4 other shipping segments that I included in this estimation of 1.5% reduction of emissions in Norway. We have the coastal route on the upper left, Hurtigruta for those who know this. We have express boats on the upper right, and then we have service, petroleum service or support vessels on the lower left, and on the lower right we have the aquaculture support vessels. So I would also like to just mention one more possible fuel for ferries and maybe also express boats, because if there are longer distances in the services, battery electric operation won't work well. Then hydrogen is an alternative. This picture is showing one of the, let's say, pilot ships or vessels that have been developed for hydrogen energy. On the graph on the right, I have compared or showing if you look at the life cycle emissions of different shipping fuels. On the left, you see the life cycle emissions of fossil fuels. In the middle or a bit to the right, we have the biofuels. But notice then in terms of hydrogen on the right, it's a very, very long range. And that depends on how you produce the hydrogen. If you use coal or some amount of gas in producing hydrogen, you can have pretty high emissions of CO2. Whereas if you can have a surplus, for instance, of wind power and produce hydrogen from that through electrolysis, you can have a very low life cycle emission. So it's very dependent on how you produce the hydrogen. So let me end up with this issue then on where is hydrogen or ammonia more attractive as a shipping fuel as compared to battery electric operation. Well, this is for longer shipping distances where the capacity of batteries is insufficient, also with regard to recharging. You also need to be aware of the losses, the number of energy losses along the hydrogen chain, which are much larger than the losses along the electric operation chain. In terms of what makes most sense in terms of cost for society, of course, this depends on a number of costs. On the battery operation, the biofuels is also an alternative here. On the cost of the power to produce this hydrogen, on the cost of gas, because gas is also a possible fuel, fossil fuel though. You can also produce hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture or CCS, as mentioned here. And of course, it depends on how much you have to pay in carbon tax or allowance price. And in any case, you need to do large investments in infrastructure to produce, transport, and bunker hydrogen. And likely also, or it would also be beneficial to have improved engine systems. Whereas natural gas and biofuels could be more competitive for long distance operations due to higher energy density by volume. This is then compared to hydrogen. So in short, there is no best fuel with the technology situation we have today. In the short distances, battery operation is the best choice if you have sufficient green energy, but in terms of longer distances, like hydrogen or maybe biofuels could be a better solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'll just ask one question before I come to Neil. Are any vessels using hydrogen or any of these other fuels at the moment?
Yes, actually on hydrogen there are some, let's say, pilot vessels that are not really fully developed, but they are under development. So there's been some testing out of such vessels. As an example, the picture I showed you, yeah, this is one of the vessels that are being developed for hydrogen. So they are barely in operation, and more of these types of vessels are developed.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to come to Neil now, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. Neil.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to speak to you today. So my name is Neil Kermode. I'm the Managing Director of EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre. And can I just confirm you're seeing my screen there?
Yes, we are.
I can see it on the feedback monitor. That's even better. That's a good layout. I like that. Okay. So I'm a civil engineer by training. I'm the chair of the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum, and I'm also a member of the Electric Vehicle Association of Scotland. So I come at this from a variety of different energy angles. And really what I wanted to try and do is to show you a little bit about what's going on and what we're seeing through the experimentation that we've done at EMEC. So Orkney is held up as something of a paragon of virtue in terms of what we've been doing in terms of renewables. And basically this comes down to the fact that we've got a lot of renewables here, and since 2013 we've generated more electricity than we've needed from renewables. And the graph on the right hand side shows a classical month, happens to be October 2017, and it shows the blue line is electricity demand, not energy, electricity demand, and the red line is the supply from renewables. So on occasions we've got more renewables than we need, and sometimes we're a bit short. So we interact with the national grid, because we're on the national grid, and we sought to try and find ways to use those red peaks to fill in some of the gaps. And that led us towards some pilot projects with hydrogen, and we started making hydrogen, in our case, really from tidal energy. That's where we kicked the whole thing off. So having started all that lot off, we then started to look at where the value was in hydrogen, and it showed up some really interesting things, which principally come down to the fact that if you look at the values of hydrogen for doing different things, on the right hand side it shows what happens if you turn hydrogen back to electricity. It's worth about 30 pence a kilogram. Whereas if you take it to propel things like ferries, it's worth about £4.60 a kilogram. So we quickly realised that using hydrogen for propulsion was potentially a much better thing than storing it and turning it back to electricity and filling in some of the gaps in the graphs on the right hand side. So that's really what led us to doing our first piece of work, which was looking at how we use hydrogen in shipping. And this was the first project that we started to look at with the MV Shappensea, which is one of the vessels owned by Orkney Islands Council that provides the internal ferry fleet. So some fitting out was done on that, including excuse me, putting on some kit by a company called Ulemco, which effectively injects hydrogen into the manifold of the engine. So this was as a fuel supplement rather than a fuel replacement. And then tanks were installed in under the deck and various things. However, we were unable to finish that project off. And that really came down to a couple of things. One was the challenges with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, who had some concerns about this, and it basically went round and round and round and round in circles, and we ran out of time in the project. So the vessel is there and equipped, but is not actually being commissioned and used. We also looked to do another project with getting hydrogen on a fuel cell aboard, and once again we went round and round and round and round in circles with the MCA, trying to get to a point where we could use hydrogen as a fuel, but they're happy for it to be carried as a cargo but not as a fuel. So there are some regulatory challenges in that bit. However, our thinking has also moved on, and I'll talk more about that in a second. In terms of what's going on in Orkney, why is it important? So an audit was done, and this is the point as an islander. An audit was done back in 2019, which shows what fuels we use, and that sort of the column that's there on the right hand side of the graphic, as it shows at the moment, shows which fuels we use. The top one being kerosene, electricity is the next purpley one down, and then it goes to road diesel and petrol, and then gas oil is the broad blue one towards the bottom. And this is used in a variety of ways, which broadly speaking breaks out into these different topics. And what it comes down to is we use that amount for heat and light, and that amount largely for transport. And the transport itself breaks out into land, air and sea. And so the challenges we've got as a society is that, yes, we've made great progress in decarbonising, but all we've actually done is the green bit in the middle I've just put up. We've decarbonised electricity, and the rest of it is the old horrible city stuff we've got to get rid of. So we know we have to decarbonise, but there's a big challenge because we've only basically done about a fifth of the energy picture, and some of that is really quite hard to deal with. So what we've done is we're going to be in 2030. And I've kept the categories broadly the same on the right hand side. That's where we are at the moment. And what we fundamentally believe is that everything is going to be run on electricity, or will have been electricity at some point. So there'll be some electricity used direct at point of use. So we're thinking that's going to be cars principally, vans, probably working up through HGVs and bits and pieces. There'll be a variety of things, but principally electrical propulsion is going to be the main thing. Heating is going to be dealt with principally by heat pumps. We do not see hydrogen really being used for heat because we don't think it's very efficient. But the interesting thing for us is how we're going to deal with our flights and our ferries, and we think it's going to be through electrolysis. And picking up the point that has been made earlier, electrolysis is going to be the key. but we think we're actually going to end up using the hydrogen to make synthetic liquid fuels, and then the stuff at the bottom will be a mix of what goes on above. So the point of deviation between what was talked about earlier and where we are is we did think that we were going to use hydrogen principally for as a gas, but we've discovered some of the challenges of handling that, and particularly holding enough of it in sufficient volumes to actually do useful work. And the regulatory problems are not inconsiderable, and the safety cases on some of the storage of this stuff is going to be a challenge. And we've looked at it and thought, you know what, there's a better way. And that really came out of some work that we did, which has been part of our journey as something of an enabler. So our job is really to test wave and tidal devices. That's our first thing. But that mentality and that approach and that capacity has led us to be able to break down barriers in other areas as well. And so once we started making hydrogen as a way round our grid problems, people were interested in taking it on. So we actually support a company called Zero Avia in using hydrogen for their flight tests of an electric hydrogen powered aircraft. But more recently, we also had a very interesting approach from a company called Zero Petroleum, who wanted to make e-fuels from hydrogen. And by taking hydrogen and carbon monoxide in this case and fusing them, they were able to make hydrocarbons. They basically made gasoline. It was gasoline. Not like gasoline, it was gasoline. And that was then supplied to the RAF, who used it for their first ever fully synthetically fueled flight. And that really opened our eyes to the fact that if you can do things with hydrogen and carbon, especially non-fossil carbon, so air captured carbon or biologically captured carbon, you can make synthetic fuels. And the advantages of liquid fuels are their portability. And I'll talk about that briefly at the last section. So we've done some work there. This stuff has been made, it worked, and we've been very impressed by that. And that's really led us into some interesting areas. We've also been working with Repsol Sinopec, who own the Flotta oil terminal, which is on the Arda Flotta in Orkney. And the graphic in the bottom right-hand corner shows the middle bit, where the circular bits is the oil facility. And they have proposals to actually effectively convert this towards electrolysis. Now, if they do that, there's that, once again, we've got a big source of hydrogen available. And the point is, we are seeing the industrial players start to take an interest in this in a way that simply wasn't the case when we kicked off these projects 5 or 6 years ago, when people looked at us askance. But as I say, what we've failed to do so far is actually get hydrogen aboard vessels. And I'd be very interested to pick up on learning that's happened elsewhere. 2 other things I just wanted to touch on. One is, it's all very well having a means by which you decarbonise your fleet, but you've got to decarbonise the right fleet. And so I wanted to draw an example about how important efficiency is. There are 2 vessels which run across the Pentland Firth between Caithness and Orkney, the MV Alfred and the MV Hamnavo. The left-hand one is a medium-speed catamaran. The right-hand one is a conventional displacement hull. And comparing the 2 vessels, the Alfred take 100 cars, do about 16 knots, 3 megawatts of power consumption, 19 million pounds in today's prices, and about 750 litres an hour. Hamnavo, same sort of size with cars, slightly faster, but dramatically increased power requirements. And the point is, it cost about 1/3 the capital cost of building the Alfred to the Hamnavo, and the fuel consumption is about half because it's a catamaran. Now, the point is, if you're going to decarbonise, it's a lot easier to decarbonise if you only got to do half the job. And I think we've really, really got to think carefully about what works, because there was concern at the start when the Alfred was, well, the predecessor, the Pentalina, was brought onto this route. It was never going to survive in the Pentland Firth. Well, I've got news for everybody. It survived perfectly well, and they've upgraded it to another vessel, which is the one that's currently over in the Western Isles. The point is, the vessel works, and I think we've got to be really careful. We don't drop ourselves into a very big hole and then try and decarbonise in the bottom of that big hole. And the other thing is that in terms of scale, the size of these vessels, if the power consumption is that low, then you could probably electrify that today. So 3 return trips a day is going to use about 18 megawatt hours a day. That would be recharging at about 2 megawatts overnight for a 9-hour slot. You know, that's kind of doable. So I think there is a big opportunity with making sure we electrify. So electrify everything you can, but then you've got to recognise there's the stuff you can't electrify, and the big vessels I don't think are able to be electrified. This is on the edge of what you can do, but beyond that you really can't just electrify. And so this is where I want to give you a very quick physics lesson or chemistry lesson about chemistry, about diesel and kerosene particularly. If you plot the density of all different fuels, and particularly plot the density of kerosene, this is what it is per amount of energy per kilogram horizontally, and the amount of energy per volume on vertically. And if you then look at fuels that are around that, some will be heavier, some will be lighter, some will require more space, some require less space. And basically what it comes down to is, if you plot all the different fuels, and the orange dots are liquids, green is hydrogen based, you can see the colors yourself there, you end up with these various densities. But if you then include the storage requirements for all this lot, i.e. keeping it in, the blue line takes you to the tip of the blue arrow is basically where it eventually falls on that graph. And the bottom line is there is nothing that requires less space and is lighter than diesel. And frankly, there's practically nothing that's half as good as diesel. So frankly, if you're trying to do the job with the same sort of configurations, you're going to need to do it with diesel. And if you're going to do it with diesel, you need to make synthetic diesel, not fossil diesel. So this is the direction that we think things need to go in. It basically comes down to electrify everything you can now, because we're going to end up with an awful lot of renewables. And the graphic on the right hand side are the ScotWind leasing rounds, which have recently been released, which I can't remember the numbers now, 28 gigawatts, which is about half of what the UK national grid is using at the moment. That's the scale of offshore wind that's about to be planted in the waters around the north of Scotland. So electrify everything you can now, because they're going to have electricity. And the point is, the energy transition is more than just electricity. We are going to need liquid fuels, but not fossil liquid fuels. And we do have the opportunity to actually make this happen. The final point is pioneering is actually underway, but we urgently need to pick up the pace. So I'm very happy to take questions on that. I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely excellent. I've been joined by Ariane Burgess. Ariane, we had to start because one of our speakers has to leave by 7. So, but thanks for coming. Right. Take questions or comments in the room and online. Those online, put virtual hands up. And in the room as well. Right, I'm gonna pick on someone. If no one puts their hand up, I'm gonna pick on someone. There you go. I was gonna pick on you anyway, Brian. So Brian Fulton, you can show your face if you wish. There you go.
Good evening, everybody. Yep, thanks very much to the two speakers. Both very interesting presentations. I think that this is a question just around electricity supply. So we at CMAL are embarking on a small vessel replacement programme. We're going for all electric ferries, and they're going to be going to some pretty remote places. So maybe just some thoughts on the challenges on electricity supply in those remote places and how you've overcome them, especially in Norway, because obviously 49 is a lot of routes, and you must have encountered some pretty remote areas. And I think, Asbjørn, you'd also said that there are some routes that you simply couldn't electrify. I'm assuming that they're still marine diesel, so just that's a kind of supplementary question. Thank you.
Asbjørn.
Yes, let me respond on that. Thank you for the questions. Yes, you are right that we have a number of ferry connections in Norway, but most of these are rather short services. So it's crossing a fjord or something like that. So I think that's a major reason why we have been so far quite successful in transforming this to battery electric operation, because it might be just half an hour service, and then you can charge on both ends. So actually, it has turned out that major challenge there has not been the kind of the ferries, but it's getting sufficient power out there to kind of some very remote places. So you had to do, further develop the local grid and also these charging stations. That has also meant quite some investments, but fortunately, as I mentioned, the government has also supported that type of infrastructure. So that's the reason why this has developed so far. Some of the connections, I think, with the current technologies are not really suitable for a battery electric operation, and for reasons that was mentioned that it's actually you're not able to pack enough power or energy into the batteries in terms of both in terms of volume and weight. And you can't recharge them either sufficiently often. So then you have to look for other solutions like hydrogen or biofuels, etc. I just wanted to add also one thing on this, and that is that I think it's very important when we talk about these solutions. There are two things. Aside from that, you have to adapt this to different segments of shipping, because the conditions are different. That is that the value chains are quite different also in terms of the different fuels here, and it's really very important that you look into the total value chain from the production, the kind of distribution, and the use of these different fuels in terms of both the money and the cost, in terms of the energy used, and also in terms of how much emissions of greenhouse gases this will lead to, because there are challenges on this because there are these energy losses and etc. etc. And then I finally just also wanted to mention that, of course, I talked about fuels, but my colleague here talked also about ship designs, of course, very important. And you have also the operational mode, like so-called slow steaming, meaning that if you reduce the speed by maybe just 2-3 knots, you can actually save a lot of energy. In both in ferries and, for instance, and express boats. Thanks.
And Neil?
Yeah, I mean, it will be really useful. In fact, I don't even start that again. It probably has been done. Brian's probably already done it in terms of understanding the grid capacity at the various terminals. And basically, short version at the moment is it's probably better on the mainland end than it is the island end generally. However, there are going to be some quite considerable changes going on with the way that wind energy is going to be proliferating. So I can see that changing quite quickly, and the scale of the energy that's needed, I think we need to get into some sort of grip, because the power consumption of ferries is quite large by today's standards, but it's not going to be that large by what we're going to do in the future. So I'm thinking back to what happened with electric cars. When we first had an electric car at EMEC, it charged at 7 kilowatts. Well, now they're charging at 300 kilowatts on some of the top end. So I think we're going to see the charging technology move quite quickly. And I would suspect that the prevalence of batteries is going to be such that, frankly, one will probably end up with a battery on shore, which is soaking up the juice while the ship is away. And when the ship plugs in, it'll then flush the energy out of the battery into the vessel. Now, I recognise it's another battery step, but I just feel that the scale of battery deployment is going to become quite considerable. And things like, say, as John mentioned, the fact that the vessels are diesel electrics, or have diesel motors aboard, I think it makes an awful lot of sense, so that we've got the resilience, because obviously the lifeline element of the service is absolutely critical. But I suspect that what will happen is we will realise over time that you will use the electric more and more and more and more. And of course, during the life of the vessel, it's likely that battery technology is going to get better, and we'll swap the batteries out. So I think the first big step is making sure that we're thinking about electrification as a starting point, being ready to do as much as we possibly can. And if we can go to more, or at least test going to other hull shapes, then we can deal with some of the challenges with catamarans. In other words, catamarans are often too light and skitter across the water. But if you've got several tons of batteries in the hulls, you're going to stick them down to the water very well. So I can see how this is actually going to work. And I think the main point is we need to try. That's what I would urge. Try something and let's find out.
Yeah, I think it's really important just to come back on the operation side of that. You look at the operation alongside alternative fuels, ferry timetables, whether it's steaming slower, that does save in energy. So yeah, for sure. Just if I may, one other. Just
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
Yep, just on the hydrogen side of things. So CMAL were involved in the High Seas 3 project. Neil, I think that's up in your neck of the woods. Were you involved in that? And I think we've got it to a point of approval in principle. Is it just the funding that is then stopping it from going forward, or are there other challenges that are getting in the way now?
I'm not quite sure where we are with that, to tell you the truth, Brian. I think the whole point was that the whole string train was tested for the ferries, as far as I recall. But I've lost sight of where we got to in terms of the storage of the amount of hydrogen one would need on shore, and then the speed with which you could put that hydrogen into the vessel, because I do think that's actually a rate limiting step. The speed with which you can charge with hydrogen is a challenge because it gets hot when you put it into the vessel. And so the heat dissipation is going to be critically important. And one can do it with a car, but I'm not sure how well that's going to scale. So a Toyota Mirai, for example, you have to refrigerate the gas to -40 when it comes out of the pump, and the tank in the car still gets to +60. So I think then that's for a car. If you do it for a ferry, I just don't know where you're going to get to.
You said there were issues with the MCA as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was really that this was a new thing for them, and we were unable to get our way through it in the time we had available in the project, because they were very rules based, which you can understand, and very conservative with a small c. But I do think there are some quite significant technical challenges we've got to work through that we've got to bring the regulator along on, and it's not a done deal.
I'll bring Colin Howden in.
Yeah, Colin Howden from Transform Scotland. Today the CPG launched its call for evidence, which is out until the 15th of August, so we'd like to hear all your views in written form. One of the questions asks about economic opportunities from decarbonisation. So a question for Asbjørn, and perhaps some comments from Neil as well. So Asbjørn, where are the battery electric ferries, where are the vessels made, and where are the batteries made? Are they made in Norway or elsewhere? And maybe Neil, could these, if we were to pursue a similar strategy to Norway, could these be made in Scotland?
Yeah, maybe first for me. Well, that is a bit technical question for me. I do know that at least the final work on the ferries is done in Norway, and there are also quite some shipyards in Norway doing that. But I also note that in for some shipping segments we actually build the hull in other countries like Turkey because there are cost savings doing that. So I'm not really sure how that is done with these ferries, but I would expect that most of the work is done in Norway, whereas the one I showed you earlier on the hydrogen express boat is actually built by a specialist yard in Western Norway, where they have specialized actually on building carbon fiber express boats like the one I showed you in the picture, and now also then building these with hydrogen as fuel.
Neil.
Yeah, so I don't think we've got the battery manufacturing capability in Scotland. Even I think we did actually invent the lithium-ion battery at Dounreay, but anyway, I may have made that up. So with the batteries will be imported in terms of the fabrication. You know, Scotland is well used to installing electrical equipment in things, and I don't think there's much of a challenge there. And the point to remember is most ferries now are electric. It's a diesel unit that's making the electricity. So it's only a change of what's in the box to a large extent. You know, what's sticking out of the box is the same. So I think that the scale of innovation is quite small. One of the pieces that is going to be quite important, and this is where Scotland should really make sure it learns from Norway's experience, and that is the means by which they are charged and plugged in. So the actual mechanism by which you come alongside and draw power has been worked out. So let's not reinvent that.
Yeah, Paul Tetlow, Transform Scotland. I think this is perhaps mostly for you, Neil. There's a bigger picture beyond ferries as to decarbonisation. You touched on it with some of your surveys of where emissions are coming from. But if we just focus on transport itself, as far as I'm aware, by far the biggest load of emissions is coming from road transport and from cars. So I wonder what percentage is actually coming from ferries. And I wonder, given the Scottish Government's target for modal shift away from car to public transport or more sustainable transport modes, what role ferry might be able to play in that, because I think historically we've just tended to build bigger and bigger ferries to carry more and more cars, and moved away from ferries serving main population centres to somewhere where you can easily offload and unload cars. So what percentage do ferries make up of the transport emissions? And what role might ferries play going forward in helping move transport to a more sustainable basis? Thank you.
Okay, Neil, I know you might have to dash. So
what I'm probably going to do is let somebody in and then dash back. This is interesting. So give me a minute if I go off camera in a second.
Right.
So I don't know the overall figures for Scotland's emissions. For Orkney, the internal ferries are about 1.5% of our emissions, and there's about another 4% for the carriage of goods to and from the islands, as far as I recall. It's that sort of scale. And a lot of that is going to be the Aberdeen, Orkney, Shetland boat, which is, in terms of energy, it uses as much electricity as the islands of Orkney do. It's a big energy sink. Big ferries use a lot of juice. So an interesting way, I put my Electric Vehicle Association of Scotland hat on, it's one of the things that we are keen to try and engage with Transport Scotland on, and that is that so far we've done a lot of work with electric cars and vans, but we've not really been able to provide some experience to what's going on with ferries. And I do think there is experience within Scotland as a whole that could be really useful with heavy electrification, to work out the art of the possible. If you excuse me, I'm going to drop off camera, let somebody in, and then I'll be right back.
Oh, okay. Good stuff. Who else wants in? Yes.
Can I ask a question? I think largely of has to be of as beyond, doesn't it? I'm David Giles of the Scottish Association for Public Transport. Could you characterise the crossings in terms of distance, time, capacity of ferry that you think are suitable for pure battery operation? I'm really talking about the large numbers that you've mentioned in Norway.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I can't be very specific on that, but I would assume that with the present battery technologies, you can operate without major challenges at least 1 hour commute, maybe even more. But then we have some ferries that maybe have a 2-hour commute, and I don't think that is really feasible with battery, with the current battery technology.
No, that's helpful because we can try and match that to routes that we know of in Scotland.
Does that also depend on the sort of conditions? You know, like, I mean, if you're out in the open sea and it was a bit rougher, would that affect that?
Only to the extent that you require more energy. I'm not an expert on that, so I can't really comment on that. But of course, if for instance you have to, if you have to go slower, actually that you will save energy. But if you have to use more energy to in rougher seas, could likely go in the opposite direction. But maybe others can give a better answer to that than me.
Presumably there's a size of vessel element to that. How many cars typically are you thinking of?
Yes, yes and no, because I mean, of course, if you have a big vessel, you can have a lot of cars and a lot of weight, but then you also have more space and for batteries. So I think there's not a simple relation between that. But I can give you a kind of different aspect to that, and that is what I refer to as express boats. They are mainly for passengers. There are a few that also might take a few cars, but these are have a much higher speed, maybe up to 40 or 38, 40 knots. And they also catamaran hulls, but they use much more energy. So with the present battery technologies, there is not enough juice, as you mentioned, in the batteries to really operate these. So then you are dependent on fossil fuels. Maybe then the hydrogen could be, or ammonia could be a fuel solution that could be developed for these vessels. Or I'm certain also that biofuels, if available, could be an opportunity. Thanks.
So Neil, I don't know if you caught that, but Asbjørn was essentially saying that he thinks that journeys of around about an hour are good for batteries. Anything over that, you probably want to be looking at something else.
I think that's the case certainly at the moment, and I think we'd see how it goes over time. So it may well be batteries get a lot better, in which case we can do other things. But if you've built it with a diesel generator in it, so the diesel generator makes electricity, which can then go in to run the motors, over time you can find out what you can do. The danger is you make a fully electric boat and then find you can't deliver the service because it didn't quite get there on the last trip, which is slightly embarrassing. Whereas if you've got the diesel there, you can do two things. One, you can improve the batteries or do what you need to. Second, if you need to, you can then use synthetic fuels, be they biodiesels or synthetic diesels made out of hydrogen, and you can then continue the service operating. The point is that making synthetic fuels is less efficient than running a battery, so you would always want to use the battery to the maximum, but you do have the fallback. And I think making sure you've got that flexibility is really important, rather than crucifying yourself on one particular technical cross.
Could I just add something on that, because we haven't talked about fisheries, but we have fisheries both in Norway and Scotland, I'm certain. But just to mention that there actually now have been developed smaller fishing vessels in Norway, which are hybrid, meaning that they have a diesel engine and they also have a battery electric engine. So they can switch for the longer commutes. They can use the diesel engine, but for let's say when they are closer to harbor or doing the fishing, they don't need so much speed. Then they can use the battery. So that it's a hybrid, but obviously it's less emissions than if they only were fueled by diesel.
And has there been any work in Norway, or Neil, are you aware of any? I mean, we talk about producing synthetic fuels. Is that being done to any great extent?
Not to a great extent. It's still very much in the R&D space, but it's been proven to be feasible. To be perfectly honest, it was done at the end of the Second World War in Nazi Germany when they had a lot of coal. It was done in South Africa when we had restrictions and through apartheid. So it's been done at times of extreme technical challenges when there were blockades. So it has been done in the past. I think what we're going to be facing is something of a self-imposed barricade or blockade now, because we don't want to use fossil fuels, and so therefore going back to these technologies does work. The other advantage in using these synthetic fuels is actually the fact that you therefore make the energy much denser. So you either end up with a lot of cylinders of hydrogen you've got to carry around, or a very small quantity of petrol or diesel in comparatively small cans. So I think the mechanism by which you're going to move energy from the energy rich areas around the coasts is actually going to be driven partly by us carrying liquid fuels about. So I can see that the act of making the most of our renewables becomes easier if you're making liquid fuels. So that's the journey that I think we're just starting on there.
Maybe I could add something also here. I did mention it briefly, but I'm not sure if you know this from before, the so-called blue hydrogen, because that is a kind of opportunity that the Norwegian oil company Equinor and also Norwegian government has put in quite a lot of expectations into. And then the concept is to use the methane or natural gas produced in Northern Norway, and through a process you produce hydrogen, but you also then of course you will release CO2, so you have to capture and store that CO2, which of course requires quite some investments. So that is, I would say, it's I'm not sure if it is really in economic terms a feasible solution, but there are some industries that have quite some beliefs in that fuel alternative.
I must admit we're keeping well away from that because blue basically means you capture the carbon, and the point is you've therefore got to really believe you have captured the carbon and put it somewhere where you know it hasn't escaped, and that is a little bit of an unknown. So in our book, green hydrogen made from electrolysis, splitting water and hydrogen and oxygen, that's the key part, but also taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and combining that with the hydrogen means that when you burn it, the carbon just goes back to where you got it from. You know, there's no additional carbon in it released into the atmosphere. You know, no fossils are harmed in the course of that process. You know, and that is important to make sure that you've got a properly sustainable process.
But in any case, what kind of fuel or value chain you choose, it has to be efficiently enough in terms of money and resources you put in and what you get out of, obviously. So that's essential. Otherwise, in my mind, you should choose some other alternative if this turns out to be you put in too much resources compared to what you get out, also in terms of the climate effect.
Neil, I think there's a T-shirt in that, isn't there? No fossils were harmed in the running of this ferry.
Okay, it's a deal. Okay, 50% to the some parliamentary fund on the sales of those T-shirts. There we go.
Excellent. We'll see. They'll do a roaring trade in Orkney, I'm sure. Anyone else want to come in? No. Oh.
No. There's a hand.
Oh yes, Lara. On you go, Lara.
Hi there. I was just wondering if there were any co-benefits of using electrification or other fuels for wildlife or people, or, you know, not just focusing on the emissions element.
So the vessels are quieter if they're electric rather than diesel, because and certainly at the lower speeds of moving around. At the higher speeds is often the noise of the vessel is dominated by propeller sound. So you get to, it's like car noise, you know, the faster you go, the noisier the car becomes. So there are those low speeds. There have been concerns about whether that is actually difficult for wildlife, because it can't hear you coming, but that doesn't seem to be an issue. There were concerns about seals near vessels which have got electric motors doing various propulsion maneuvering activities, and it was found it wasn't actually a problem. So I think we need to be very careful about it, and keep our eyes and ears open about that. The other thing, of course, is that if you've got electricity, you haven't really got oil to spill on the water. And we're all used to seeing those small slicks and stuff that occur in harbours and things. So one would expect to see cleaner water from that point of view. And then it really depends. If you get into some of the other fuels like synthetic kerosene, synthetic petrols, you've got the same hydrocarbon problems. It's still a hydrocarbon. And then things like methanol and ammonia have got other challenges of their own in terms of toxicity. So once again, but those are things that are handled within the scope of most chemical industries are used to handling it, but it's a different skill set that will be needed for mariners who are operating with this. The one thing we are not touching, that we've kept well away from, is liquid hydrogen, and that's purely because of the difficulties of handling it. It's at minus 255 centigrade or whatever it is, and it's a pretty pernicious material. So we suspect that that's going to be rather difficult to handle in the marine environment.
To this, we could also add avoiding air pollution, because there will be some air pollution and particles even if you're scrubbing the exhaust from, let's say, a diesel-operated ferry. It's quite obvious, but you know that's also part of or one consequence of using electricity for power.
I'm afraid I really am going to have to go because I can hear my meeting starting in the room behind me at the moment.
Neil,
They're getting restive.
Really appreciate it. I'll probably wrap it up there anyway, but listen, it's been absolutely fascinating listening to you both. You know, it really is appreciated. We'll have a call for views, and at the end of it, we will produce a report with recommendations. So hopefully you'll see your contributions reflected somewhere in that.
Thanks. And if you want any of the, well, I've already sent the slides in. If you want to use any of them, then feel free.
Fantastic, and thanks for coming back to rejoin the meeting. Okay.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Nice meeting you. Thanks all. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
I could also add that of course, I've sent you the presentation, but I also sent to Laura a PDF on my article that I showed in the start of my presentation. So if anyone is more interested in details, please take a look at this article. Thank you.
And we can share those with CPG members. So that's great. Yeah. So I think that is everything. Yeah. So that is it for tonight. Thank you everyone for attending, and thanks for your contributions. And thank you, Asbjørn. Again, really appreciated. And as I say, I've set out what we'll do over the summer. There's Brian back, looking cheerful as ever. There you are. Good. Okay, so I'll end it there, and Parliament will go into recess at the end of next week, and then we'll have a meeting
in the autumn,
sometime in the autumn. So we'll come back to members about that. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.